Good morning, everybody. My name's Aubrey Lyons. I'm the Executive Director of the Montana World Affairs Council. Is the best way to look, Allie?
There's the camera right there.
Thank you guys all for taking your morning to be with us. We are really excited to have Dr. James Person with us this morning, who is the Director of the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korea History and Public Policy at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. It's a mouthful. He has a PhD in modern Korea history from the George Washington University, where he also teaches courses on North Korean history. We also would like to thank our council sponsors, Council in the Classroom sponsors, for making this possible, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation and the Plum Creek Foundation, as well as our local sponsors for this program, the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center at the University of Montana. We would also like to especially thank the Wilson Center and the Korea Foundation. And I would like to put a plug in for our next program on Cuba on December 8th, as well as our 11th annual Academic World Quest International Competition on February 23rd. Without further ado, I'm sure you guys have quite a few questions you've prepared, and I would like to turn things over to our guest, Dr. Person.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'd also like to just make sure that all the schools have their mics muted while Dr. Person is speaking, and then we will open it up for questions and interactions shortly after.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here to talk a bit about Korean history and about some of the work that we're doing at the Wilson Center. And so a lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Korea as an exporter of culture. Some of you may recognize here this image of Psy, the performer who has made the horsey dance famous. Some of you may have also seen some Korean dramas. To show of hands, anyone ever watch a Korean drama? Anyone? Well, Korean dramas, I think I saw a hand in the back there somewhere. Korean dramas are actually becoming quite the cultural phenomenon throughout the world. Really, despite the fact that they're in Korean, the subtitled dramas are really having a tremendous impact and are getting more and more people interested in Korea. A country that is in Northeast Asia, surrounded by big powers. You have, of course, Japan and China and Russia, all surrounding Korea. If you look at a political map of the Korean Peninsula, you see, just how much the peninsula is, in fact, surrounded by larger powers. You have, again, Japan, but you also have shared borders with Russia and with China. The Korean Peninsula, the Korean people like to say that Korea is a shrimp surrounded by whales. And what happens when whales fight? Well, the shrimp's back is broken. But that in many ways reflects a mentality, this expression reflects a mentality of weakness and of vulnerability. And this has certainly been an issue in the past. Korea has been invaded by its neighbors throughout history. We'll talk about that briefly. But Korea, modern Korea today, modern Korea is really becoming, with its cultural impact and with its economic prowess, really becoming more like a dolphin that skillfully maneuvering and skillfully navigating the seas in this very rough neighborhood where it is surrounded by great powers. And then, of course, you have the ongoing issue of national division and North Korea, which poses a significant security threat to both to South Korea, but also to the entire region, and increasingly with the development of its nuclear weapons program, to the world, to the United States in particular. So let's kind of do a quick overview of of Korean history. Just a very quick one. I'm going to take you through 5,000 years in a matter of minutes here. So some scholars claim that you really have to go back to the year, to 2333 BC, when the Korean people first began to occupy the peninsula and develop states. There was a rather large state that took up both the peninsula and much of northeast, what is today Manchuria or northeast China, referred to as Kojosan. And this state existed, or states that constituted this larger country existed through 200 AD. We don't know a whole lot about this, about Kojosan, other than the fact that it did occupy a territory that was much larger than the peninsula is today. One of the first major invasions came during the first century, from 108 to 1313. You had the Chinese came in and occupied the peninsula, setting up commanderies on half of the peninsula here. Interestingly, the Korean people refer to, or the Korean name for Korea today is Taehanminguk, and you hear in there Han, Taehan. Han actually comes from the name of the Korean states that remained in existence on the very southern tip of the peninsula. If you look at the image here, you have several Han states. You have Mahan, Pyeonhan, and Sinhan. So it's from these Han states that the name Taehanminguk comes today. From these tribes that were on the very southern tip of the peninsula, as these Chinese commanderies occupied much of the rest of the Korean peninsula. You then have emerging from these tribes, and you have several states emerging on the peninsula after the Chinese exited from the peninsula after 313 AD. You have one large state called Goguryeo that occupies much of the territory of Kojosan, which was that first large state, including much of northeast China. But you also have three states in the southern half of the peninsula. You have Silla, Kaya, and Paekje. Over time, Silla becomes the dominant state, and we have what is called the period of unified Silla. And but you have to question just how unified it was, because it certainly doesn't incorporate all of the territory once occupied by Kojosan. It doesn't include, for example, northeast China. In fact, it doesn't go all the way up even to the present borders of Korea. So some people question this notion of unified, of this being a period where unification was in fact achieved. We get closer to the present day borders of Korea when with another dynasty, the creation of the Goryeo dynasty. And this, most people will think that the name Korea today comes from the name of this dynasty, Goryeo. And again, the present day borders are the borders of the Goryeo dynasty are closer to what are today the present day borders of Korea. The last dynasty to rule the peninsula from 1392 to 1910 was the Chosun dynasty, and it's during this last period that the present-day borders are established for the most part. There were even into the 1960s negotiations between North Korea and China over the border, but the present-day border was more or less established during the Chosun dynasty, which ruled the country from 1392 to 1910. It's during this period that much of the many cultural attributes that we today identify as Korean came into existence, including, for example, the clothing, the traditional clothing that many Korean people wear on holidays, called the hanbok. If you travel to Seoul today, you can actually rent hanbok and walk around the palaces and around the tourist areas in Korea. Han, you see the word Han here again. You mentioned, or you remember, I mentioned the name Han comes from the three tribes on the southern half of the peninsula. So the hanbok, bok meaning clothing. Han again representing Korean. Hanbok, so the costume or the clothing of the Korean people. This came into existence. A lot of the food that we now recognize as being Korean was from this period, including kimchi. Kimchi was used or was eaten by Koreans, or there was a long tradition of preserving and pickling food, but it's during this period, for example, that pepper first is introduced, and pepper actually comes from Mexico. Mexico through Japan and then into Korea, and Korean people started then growing the chili peppers there and started using it so that today you have the very spicy Korean food. So a lot of these things come from this last period.
Can I pause for a second? I'm really curious to see if any of our schools have ever, or any of our students have ever tried Korean food. Can we, just with a visual, can you give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you've ever tried Korean food? Oh, I see.
Excellent.
That's
wow.
Fantastic. Yay. So it's not a lot of yeses and a few nos. How about kimchi? Has anybody ever had kimchi?
Now, and thumbs up if you've liked it. Oh no. It is an acquired taste. It's very spicy, but it's in fact there are thousands of varieties of kimchi. It's quite interesting. So if you didn't like the spicy kind that is most commonly eaten, I encourage you to try the others. In fact, visit Seoul and there's a kimchi museum.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
And just for clarification, for those that have not tried kimchi, would you mind explaining exactly what
Sure.
kimchi is?
Kimchi is a fermented. Well, I mean, again, there are thousands of varieties. The most common variation is pickled cabbage. It's like the Napa cabbage. What they do is they'll pickle it and salt it and then add other spices to it, including the pepper, the red pepper, the chili pepper, that again was imported from Mexico through Japan and introduced to the Korean Peninsula. It's dried and ground up and added, mixed with the pickled cabbage, along with other things. I don't want to make it sound but there's oyster sauce, and sometimes we'll even add oysters to it. But really delicious and very healthy. Lots of lots of antioxidants. Yes. In kimchi. And this is one of the major cultural exports of Korea today is kimchi. I'm so happy to see that so many of you have actually tried Korean food and in particular kimchi.
Yeah.
Now, Korea again. So a lot of the things that we now identify as Korean really come from this last period of dynastic rule on the peninsula. Then Korea's fortunes really turned when from 1910 to 1945, Korea fell under the rule of the Japanese Empire. So Japan, which was really the first Asian state to modernize, colonized the Korean Peninsula. They, at first in 1905, they created a protectorate over Korea. In 1910, they fully annexed Korea. And for the next 35 years, Korea was part of the Japanese Empire. At some points, at one point during the later, from the 1930s, Korean people were prevented from, or were discouraged from speaking Korean. They were forced to assimilate and take Korean, or actually take Japanese names. The Japanese colonial authorities did their best to eliminate symbols of cultural pride. They sought to eliminate Korean culture. They also destroyed or removed from Korea cultural heritage items. Today, there are many items that many great artistic items that are still in Japan today in museums and in temples. The ruling dynasty, or the Korean dynastic leaders, the leaders of the Joseon dynasty, were forced to marry with Japanese royal or members of the royal family, and so you had the elimination even of this royal line, the royal bloodline from Korea. Korea was liberated, though, from Japanese colonial rule in 1945. And at first it was just divided at the 38th parallel as a matter of expediency. I mean, it was seen as being, the United States was just starting the occupation of Japan, or I'm sorry, had just defeated Japan, and was concerned with occupying Japan. The Soviets were entering. Had entered northern Korea and had in fact moved down towards the 38th parallel. And with the defeat of Japan, then the U.S. feared that the Soviets would in fact be able to go all the way to the south and occupy the entire peninsula. So a deal was struck at the last second to divide the peninsula and to have two zones of occupation. The U.S. Was able to get people to South Korea as administrators to oversee the elimination or the dismantling of the Japanese colonial government, whereas Soviet officials were in northern Korea. So from 1945 to 1948, you had two zones of occupation on the peninsula. The northern half, the Soviets; southern half, you have U.S. military officials.
Can I pause for a second?
Sure.
I'm really curious about some of our schools, and maybe we can even go through them really quickly. But as we all know, last Wednesday was Veterans Day, and I'm really curious because Montana, and I don't know if you know this, but Montana actually has a very high number of veterans.
Yes.
In fact, we have one of the highest per capita states of veterans. And I'm wondering if any of the students today, if they had family members or friends, grandparents that were in Korea, if you could show us just by raising your hands.
Oh my goodness.
Right.
Wow.
I sort of thought that, yep, absolutely.
Wow.
Has anybody ever talked, and if you want to raise your hand, has anybody ever talked to their grandparents about that experience?
That's fascinating. That's great.
I know. Do we?
Yeah. There are many oral history projects.
Yeah.
And lots of, we're actually now getting a lot of documents about the U.S. role in Korea and about our participation. It's from this period, from 1945, where the United States really becomes involved in Korean affairs. Both, well, starting with the occupation of the southern half of the peninsula immediately after the liberation from Japanese colonial rule. But what was initially supposed to be a temporary occupation and a temporary division, so that you could manage this process of eliminating the Japanese colonial system, turned into, unfortunately, sadly, the division of the peninsula, a permanent division of the peninsula. During the Japanese colonial period, you had the Korean people. Many Korean people were very eager to throw off the reins of Japanese colonial rule. They sought to regain their independence. Mm-hmm. As you've seen, for almost 5,000 years, the Korean people had independent states. Some of them very powerful, occupying even larger territory than the peninsula today.
Could we ask our students just really quickly if they have any questions?
Sure.
Maybe you've heard stories and maybe you have a question that came up from maybe talking to one of your grandparents. Let's see, I believe that Sealy Lake, I saw quite a few hands in Sealy Lake, so I'm going to start with you. Do you have any questions about that period of time, maybe from stories or something that you would like to sort of... Go ahead, Sealy Lake. Yep, just have to unmute you.
Okay, question, Major.
Did they use Agent Orange in Korea as well, or was that just not?
Did you hear that?
During the Korean War, there were uses of some defoliant. I don't know if it was exactly Agent Orange, if it was the same composition that was used in Vietnam. But certainly during the Korean War, they did use some defoliant technologies. But I think it was I don't know that Agent Orange was invented yet. I know they used napalm as a again was very destructive. But I don't know that it was Agent Orange.
Good question.
Yeah.
Sealy Lake, any other questions about that period of time? All right, let's move over to Stanford. Stanford, I saw that you had some hands raised as well. Any questions? Any comments? How about Bozeman? Oh, I see a hand in Bozeman. Wonderful.
Okay, Caleb, yeah, Mike?
Yeah,
Just a little closer.
A little closer.
Yeah.
See me, I guess, I know that North Korea obviously is not a huge fan of the United States, but I just wanted to know, like, especially at that World War II, post-World War II time period, like the attitudes in South Korea specifically towards the United States and its basically occupation.
I'm sorry. There was I lost the audio just for a second there.
Yeah.
Stay away from me. So I was just wondering that, no, that way, this way. Okay. This is so demanding. I see I'm trying for the mic.
We see your arm.
I was just wondering, North Korea obviously is not a huge fan of the United States, but I was wondering the attitudes in South Korea specifically during that post-World War II era towards the U.S.
Excellent question. No, and yeah, to say that North Korea is not a fan of the U.S., understatement of the century. No, you're absolutely right. They, in fact, they're the whole. They seem to mobilize their people and unfortunately keep their people suppressed by in basically this almost slavery-like conditions by highlighting what they think is a U.S. threat. But South Korea, on the other hand, they are among our strongest allies in the world. And it really goes back to this period, So, I guess let me give a little more background here. So again, meant to be a temporary division of the peninsula. Unfortunately, during the colonial period, you have, as I said, the Korean people were very eager to achieve national independence and to have their sovereignty restored. And there were different paths or people, there are different ways that people tried to do this. You had some people that were revolutionary nationalists who wanted to take up arms against the Japanese to achieve independence. Then you had others who sought to work with the Japanese to modernize Korea, to make the country stronger, and then eventually to seek independence. And then you had still others who sought recognition from the international community so that Korea could be recognized, or Korea's sovereignty would be recognized and restored. And the first and the last of these approaches, we could call those the left and right. The left-right split in achieving independence became a north-south division. In the north, you had these revolutionary nationalists who took up arms against the Japanese with little effect. It was the U.S. and the Soviet actions against Japan on Korea that led to the liberation of the Korean people. These revolutionary nationalists who fought against the Japanese in Manchuria were placed by Soviet officials, because they were communists, in power in North Korea. And the Soviets supported these communist officials and supported the creation of a separate communist state on the northern half of the peninsula to guarantee that the peninsula, which is very strategic, they wanted to make sure that the peninsula didn't fall into the hands of a pro-U.S. government. So the Soviets supported then the creation of the North Korean state. In the south, those who sought national recognition for Korea during the colonial period by the international community, those who worked within the international community, they came to power with the support of the United States. And these are the first two leaders of the two separate Korean states. You have Syngman Rhee, educated at George Washington University, at Harvard University, and then Princeton University. Lived in the United States from 1904 to 1945, seeking recognition for Korea. He becomes the first president of the Republic of Korea, South Korea. Kim Il-sung was appointed by the Soviets. He fought the Japanese as a partisan guerrilla fighter in Manchuria with little impact. But managed not to get captured by the Japanese. He survived. Had a bit of a reputation as somebody who was fighting the Japanese, and so the Soviets appointed him. But you had then from this period this zero-sum game of mutual antagonism. Neither recognized the other. And in 1950, North Korea attacked South Korea. And you have this 3-year fratricidal war in which the United States comes to the aid of South Korea. The United States and 13 other countries fighting under the banner of the United Nations, they come to support South Korea, which was the only in which North Korea had its own elections, but it was purely staged. In Southern Korea, the southern half of the peninsula, the election and the creation of the state was actually overseen by the United Nations, giving it much greater legitimacy. So the United Nations then came to the aid of South Korea, blocking this aggression from this communist, or the Soviet-backed and Soviet and Chinese-backed state of Northern Korea. And this is what I suspect many of your grandparents and perhaps great-grandparents got involved in Korea in the Korean War and serving in Korea to block then or to prevent, traveling to a country that probably none of them had ever even heard of. Again, from 1910 to 1945, Korea didn't exist. It was part of the Japanese colonial empire. So your grandparents and great grandparents then went to traveled to a country, this newly created country. They probably didn't even know where it was, and they were going to defend people that they had never had any encounter, any interaction with, and prevented the takeover of this country by the North Korean regime. I know some of you have. So the relationship from this period has really been cemented. I mean, it's really, you could talk about an alliance that's really forged in blood. Fighting alongside one another to defend the country. And there were great, many losses from the Americans. I think 54,000 people either died or including casualties. So that was a tremendous sacrifice. We see also that just after the war, we enter into a formal military alliance, and U.S. soldiers remain in South Korea today as sort of a tripwire if North Korea were to ever get the crazy idea of attacking again. And they've tried. They've tried on numerous occasions. In the late 1960s, for example, North Korea sought to provoke, or to, they actually, on almost a daily basis, there were some about 350 incursions across the line, the demilitarized zone, into South Korean territory. They also sent in large numbers of commandos to attack South Korea. In 1975, we have conversations between this guy right here, Kim Il-sung, and Chinese officials, where Kim Il-sung is again talking about, like in 1950, about attacking South Korea. Going in and starting a second Korean War. So, but the United States troops have remained in South Korea, as a tripwire, preventing that attack again from North Korea. It's of course getting more and more dangerous today as North Korea is now developing new weapons, including nuclear weapons. But the United States' commitment to South Korea is greatly appreciated by. This is a long answer to your question, but the South Korean people today recognize the tremendous commitment and sacrifices of the American people to the safety and security of South Korea, and we've provided that security umbrella under which they've been able to achieve some economic miracles. South Korea in 1945, after liberation, and then especially after the Korean War in 1953, was among the poorest nations in the world. And today, it's one of the most has one of the most robust economies in the world. It's one of our largest trading partners, and it's a producer of a culture that we all again know Gangnam Style. Many of you have watched Korean dramas, and many of you have eaten Korean food, and so it's that U.S. security umbrella that's really helped in many ways to make this possible. But
yeah, I also just want to go down to Darby too, because I know that I don't want to forget about Darby. Darby, did you guys have any questions as well? And we can open it up for other schools.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
yes.
This summer, I read Aquariums of Pyongyang, which is life from a boy's perspective of a prison camp of North Korea. And this weekend, I happened to pick up Simon Winchester's new book about the Pacific. And in that book, there's a chapter on the Koreas, and he uses the capture of the USS Pueblo in 1968 as an example to kind of frame his arguments. And he actually took like a 2 or 3 month long trip along the DMZ where he hiked along it. And those experiences that I had kind of reflect on something that we've been talking about in our class as we get ready for, some of the students here in my class are getting ready for Model United Nations. We're trying to solve problems between North and South Korea, and it looks like throughout all these examples that North Korea is very intransigent, and they don't seem to even be partly making an effort to establish any sort of normal relationships. They relish, like in Simon Winchester's word, they relish the idea of being a rogue state, and they still own or keep the USS Pueblo, I guess, as sort of a museum piece. My question is, having those things as a backdrop, what sort of hope do you have for Kim Jong-un or any of the military leaders of North Korea being able to establish any sort of dialogue with at least South Korea, if not China or Japan, or using Russia as an intermediary with the United States?
Excellent question. There have been efforts for the international community to deal with the North Korea situation and help to improve the security situation on the peninsula, in and around the peninsula. There are the six-party talks involving many of the countries you just named: China, Japan, Russia, the United States, South Korea, and of course North Korea. Really haven't been very successful because of that. Really, because of North Korea. North Korea is just not committed to resolving these situations. They are, unless things can be done on their terms, then they're not interested. They're still delusional in the sense that they think that they can unify the Korean Peninsula on their own terms, meaning having a communist regime that would reunify the entire peninsula. And though they're getting more defensive, so now it's closing off dialogue. Now that they're realizing that, with South Korea becoming just this economic powerhouse and cultural powerhouse, they recognize that the likely scenario for unification is going to be absorption, and so they're becoming more defensive and trying to prevent that. And so it's just basically, you could say that they're now engaged in these provocative actions to try to convince the world that they have some military prowess and that they are certainly to be feared, and that we can't seek to topple them and to reunify through the absorption of North Korea. So they're trying to just prevent and to maintain then some status quo, but it's really largely to keep this privileged elite in power. The book that you mentioned, the Aquariums of Pyongyang. I mean, it's again a book about labor, or about prison camps and labor camps in North Korea, where you have, I think it's about 1% of the population is in these labor camps. Another large percentage of the population is at risk of malnutrition, of starvation, even at the best of times. And those who, I've been to North Korea a couple times, traveled throughout the country, and it's really one of the most depressing places I've ever been to. The capital city, they are investing a lot of money in these projects like the ice skating rinks and ski resorts and water parks and other amusement parks, but it's all for show. You go outside of the capital, and it's just desperately poor, where you see unpaved roads, or if in fact they paved some of the roads just because we were coming. But the only means of transportation, or you walk, or ox carts, or they take trucks, and because there's no fuel, because of fuel shortages, they've actually retrofitted these trucks, and many of them are Soviet era trucks. from the 60s and 70s. They're these trucks that were given to North Korea, but they've turned them into wood-burning trucks. So there's this sort of a combustion engine that they build on the back of it, and they will stop on the side of the road, chop down a tree, put the logs and the wood in the back of this burner, and once it gets up, builds up enough steam, they go on the road again. And then when you run out of fuel again, you just stop, chop down another tree. So desperately poor. But the ruling elite, they're determined to maintain their privileged life, despite the suffering of the masses. And they're doing everything in their power to prevent any progress in inter-Korean relations or in resolving security situations on the peninsula.
I want to open it up to some more questions.
Yeah.
I think those stories are pretty compelling that you've just shared with us, and I'd like to hear a student's perspective on that. Let's go ahead. Who would like to start us off today? The question. Bozeman. All right, let's hear it.
How you were able to travel into North Korea? What allowed you to do that?
Well, I mean, we don't have diplomatic relations, but we can actually go. I mean, if they give you the visa, there are any number of ways you can go. There are travel organizations that do organize trips to North Korea. There are also, and many of them operate out of China, but there are also, you can get invited by, I mean, if you have, a number of people are invited by their foreign ministry or whatnot. But the most common way to go is through these travel companies. Now, most people are only going to see what they want you to see. So you will go and see these monuments, and you have to go and lay flowers at the feet of these giant statues of their leaders, because there's such a robust cult of personality, really damaging cult of personality, where it's almost you worship. They worship these leaders. We're already in the third dynasty, or the third ruler of this Kim family dynasty. Kim Il-sung, who you see on the screen, his son Kim Jong-il took over and ruled from 1994 until 2011, and now in the third son, or the third leader is Kim Jong-il's son, Kim Jong-un. But as you go and you have to pay homage to their leaders, and you see all these triumphant, these monuments that they've built to their leaders. It's really it's like an Orwellian nightmare, but it's possible to go. Do not go for vacation though. You really need to decompress after going. I mean, it's really the most depressing place you've ever been to. I mean, you leave and it's just. You can't describe. I mean, the feeling that when you get off the plane in Beijing, for example, and then you fly to Seoul, and this is what I've done, and you're just amazed at the contrast. You arrive in this modern society in South Korea, because there are no direct flights between South Korea and North Korea, so. You have to fly to China first, and then I connect and get a flight to Seoul from there. You arrive in Seoul, and your cell phone starts vibrating because you connect to the Wi-Fi, and you get all the emails that you didn't get when you were in North Korea, because of course you're not even connected. And the North Koreans, until recently, they even impounded your phone because they didn't want you to have any devices that could. May have had GPS, or may have caught signals from China or something, but then just what you see in South Korea when you arrive after being in North Korea, it's almost like a post-traumatic stress. I mean, it's just you have you recognize that people don't understand what you've witnessed in North Korea, and just the poverty, the repression. But no, I mean, it's possible to go. Do I recommend? No, not unless you have a professional interest. It's just not a pleasant place to visit.
That was a good question, Bozeman. Thank you. Stanford, do you have any questions? Yes. Oh, you have to unmute your microphone first. Oh, for some reason I am not hearing you. I think maybe when you reconnected.
Was he a coffee?
If you want to go in on the side on the settings, I think you can probably find that integrated microphone. While you're working on that, I am going to go ahead and go over to Sealy.
You are weird.
So I understand that North Korea is fairly, like, they don't trade a lot. So what is their main source of, like, income to support those families that are in power?
Excellent question. They don't. Yeah, they don't trade a lot. Now during the Cold War, they certainly benefited from bilateral trade relations with other communist countries. They had preferred trade agreements or trade, agreements with other communist states. The interesting thing is they didn't integrate. Now, you remember I talked about, during the period of Japanese colonial rule, you had these two different, or you had a couple of different paths, but you had the revolutionary nationalists who were fighting for immediate independence, and then the other who then took over, who became the leaders of South Korea, who integrated into the world economy and sought international recognition. North Korea never integrated. They feared that if you become integrated into even the communist system, the communist trade system, it was called the International Division of Labor. It was part of this trade agreement within the communist bloc. They feared that they would be exploited, that they would lose their freedom of action, that larger communist countries would tell them what to produce, what not to produce. So they never really fully integrated, even into this socialist camp economic bloc. Instead, what they did is they had these bilateral hub and spokes trade relations. They benefited from the existence of the socialist camp, and they had these preferred trade relations. But after the collapse of the socialist camp in the late 80s, early 90s, this is a time when they became dependent on international aid. In many ways today they are dependent on international aid, but they also engaged a lot in illegal activities such as narcotics and counterfeit tobacco, counterfeit money, counterfeit U.S. dollars, $100 bills. They engage in a lot of illicit activities to gain or to finance the regime, but they also do have trade relations. I mean, they're not completely isolated. They have some trade relations with Japan. Interestingly, with South Korea, there is some trade through specific areas. There's an industrial complex where North and South Korea are working in the town of Kaesong, which is actually in North Korea. And then, of course, China. China is the main lifeline and provides a lot of the economic support and is their largest trading partner. And, of course, with Russia, there is a robust trade. But China, by far, I think like over 80% of their trade comes from China. And China is really supporting them out of fear of collapse. If China were to pull back on its economic support, then the North Korean regime would likely just would collapse, and this could lead to masses of Korean refugees crossing over into northeast China.
Wonderful.
Yeah, good question.
Stanford, did you get? I'm going to come back to you. Can you talk to us now? Nope. Okay.
No.
You know what? Here's the deal, Stanford. If you want to email me that question, if I don't have time to answer it right now, we will get the answer to you by the end of the day. Let's go over to Darby.
ask if we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So when reading your biography, you are the Woodrow Wilson Scholar, sponsored by Hyundai. And
Right.
could you just explain to us what that means, kind of, so what your job is in that area?
Yeah, thrilled to. So Hyundai Motor Company and the Korea Foundation have both provided us with funding to go into international archives to gather documents on modern Korean history. North Korea is, of course, largely inaccessible. I mean, as I mentioned, you can visit there, but they don't give you documents on their history. Their archives are closed off. So what we do is we go into international archives, the archives of the former socialist camp, the former communist countries. We go into their archives and we get their diplomatic record on relations with North Korea. So you go into the Russian archives, for example, and you can get conversations between their leaders and Russian leaders or Soviet leaders. The Soviet embassy also produced these detailed reports on what was going on inside North Korea throughout the Cold War. So we get these documents from Russian, Romanian, Albanian, East German, Polish, I'm missing a few, Mongolian, Chinese archives. We get these documents, we translate them, and then we release them. And you can see them on, if you go into Google, type in Modern Korean History Portal. So again, Modern Korean History Portal, and it'll take you to the website, and you'll be able to look at a lot of these translated documents. So that's for North Korea, that's what we do. South Korea, while we have access to the archives there, while we have access to South Korean officials as very, very close allies, the government hasn't always been very good at preserving documentation. There have been a number of Korea has had a history of you had a military dictatorship or two actually, and a lot of materials were not preserved, and so we're finding that this technique that we used in gathering materials on North Korea is also helpful when learning about South Korea's history. So we're going into the archives of South Korea's allies, including the U.S. archives. Fortunately, the National Archives are just a 20-minute drive from the Wilson Center, so we can go to the archives on a regular basis and gather documents on our relations with South Korea. Go to the British archives and gather materials. And we're releasing these as well. And the idea is to release these materials to help scholars, to help researchers, to help students get a better understanding of the political, diplomatic, economic history of modern Korea and both South Korea and North Korea. And this has really had we're thrilled that we've had a real impact on how history is being written. It's a very exciting project to be part of. Yes, and Hyundai and the Korea Foundation have been very supportive of our activities.
Wonderful. Well, we are about out of time, as you can see. Unfortunately, we have class periods that we have to get to.
Okay.
But I want everybody to help me please thank you, Dr. Person, in coming and sharing this information with us.
Thank you.
I also want to let you know, teachers and I will be sending this to you hopefully by tomorrow morning.
Good day.
Dr. Person is going to record a couple of essential questions for you to use as follow-up. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email them to me, and I will then pass them along. We can have those answered. So thank you guys so much for participating today, and we will see you again soon. Thank you, and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.